Good morning, or again, whatever time you happen to be listening to us. It's morning. It's 9:43 on Thursday, October 24th. This is actually the lecture that would have been done on October 31st, so a week from today. We're talking about Emma Goldman or anarchism today. So it will pick up on some of the themes that we talked about with Thoreau. And in fact, Goldman will actually mention Thoreau. We'll talk a little bit about women's rights, women's emancipation. So a number of those themes will get brought up. So I'm going to dive into the text. We'll spend, as with these lectures I've been doing, since we don't have our group presence to talk with one another, we'll have to spend most of my time talking about the text. And then you can then ask questions about that in the forum or on, we could wait till I get back to class. So I want to begin on page 422 of this book. This is just the second page of the Emma Goldman reading Anarchism, What It Really Stands For. She wrote this in 1907. So as I've said before, anarchism was perceived as a legitimate political movement. It didn't quite have some of the connotations that it might have today in popular mind, that it's kind of a force of anarchism, of disruption. From Goldman's perspective, as she will lay out, it is a true social movement that sees to the betterment of all human beings rather than just seeking chaos and destruction. It does seek the destruction of the state, which is where the anarchism comes from, but that's because, as Goldman will put it, the state has actually been the source of violence. And this is where, as Goldman herself will admit, she draws influence from Henry David Thoreau, or just David, as she calls him. So the second complete paragraph on the left of page 422, she begins by saying, and she writes very well, so she says, "Destruction and violence. How is the ordinary man to know that the most violent element in society is ignorance? That its power of destruction is the very thing anarchism is combating? Nor is he aware that anarchism, whose roots, as it were, are part of nature's forces, destroys not healthful tissue, but parasitic growths that feed on the life's essence of society. It is merely clearing the soil from weeds and sagebrush that it may eventually bear healthy fruit." So, in other words, kind of like Thoreau was saying, the power of the state depends upon an ignorant populace, on a populace that stays stunted in its growth, stunted in its self-development, stunted in its self-awareness and self-consciousness. And it's in that way that the state's able to use us as fodder in machines, as fodder for warfare, as cogs in the enterprises and industries that really just kind of use us for the needs of the few. And those few usually are the ones with both political and economic power, where those largely become indistinguishable from one another. So the anarchists feel that by combating the powers of the state, sorry for the noise behind me, for those combating the powers of the state, they are also combating economic inequality along the way. And so she says that now that communism, Marxism, was also combating a similar process. But what she argues is that anarchism is the only one that really handles it well. So she puts, this is on page 423. She says, "Anarchism is the only philosophy which brings to man the consciousness of himself, which maintains that God, the state, and society are non-existent, that their promises are null and void, since they can be fulfilled only through man's subordination. Anarchism is therefore the teacher of the unity of life, not merely in nature, but in man. There is no conflict between the individual and the social instincts any more than there is between the heart and the lungs. The one, the receptacle of a precious life essence, the other, the repository of the elements that keep the essence pure and strong. The individual is the heart of society, conserving the essence of social life. Society is the lungs which are distributing that element to keep the life essence, that is, the individual pure and strong." So that it's a false dichotomy between the individual and society. The society really flourishes when the individual flourishes, is I think, Goldman's point. And what the state does is the state gains power and thrives when the individual is suffering, when the individual is weakened, put into a state of ignorance, put in states of dependency, and so on. And then she cites Emerson. As I had mentioned before when I talked about transcendentalism, Thoreau and the anarchist movement was very influenced by transcendentalism. So she says here, the one thing, this is the very next paragraph, the one thing of value in the world, says Emerson, is the active soul. This every man contains within himself. The soul active sees absolute truth and utters truth and creates. In other words, the individual instinct is the thing of value in the world. It is the true soul that sees and creates the truth alive, out of which is to come a still greater truth, the reborn social soul. So, as I had said when I talked about transcendentalism, and we can see here that Goldman is really just kind of repurposing some of the main themes of transcendentalism for her views of anarchism. The point that Emerson stresses is that the state is not the true good, is not the true source of right and wrong. It's the individual soul that's the true source of right and wrong. The state is merely not even really a necessary. I mean, you might see it as a necessary, but it's sort of the objective face of what is good, but not the true source. And in the end, the less we can rely on the objective powers to enforce the good and rely on our internal self-realization of the good, our own self-consciousness, then the less we can do without the state. So, I mean, this is where she sees in both Thoreau and Emerson basically calling for anarchism, calling for the end of the state and calling for a society where it's mere individuals realizing their own good and pursuing that good as a way that furthers the society as a whole. So I skipped over, I'm looking at my notes, I skipped over her definition of anarchism. It's the very bottom left of 422. So she says, anarchism, the philosophy of a new social order based on liberty unrestricted by man-made law, the theory that all forms of government rest on violence and are therefore wrong and harmful as well as unnecessary. So one of the, I guess there's 2 points here. The notion of man-made law is this objective law that puts us under its power and authority, where the ultimate law comes from within. It's our conscience, as Thoreau would have said. The other point here is that all governments rest on violence. Right? All the authority of government rests on its ability to lock you in prison, like it did with Thoreau. And the argument for the state is that it is necessary for order, that it's necessary for getting things done, it's necessary for maintaining efficiency, right? Someone's got to do the trash, someone's got to make the roads, someone's got to make sure the airplanes run on time or safely. So all these things need at some point someone in the government to make sure that these things get done well. There's a lot of good arguments there, and I'm not saying that those are wrong, but what the anarchists are saying, and those who kind of pick up with Goldman and continue the anarchist theme today, they would claim that, yes, that is all correct. We don't want planes crashing into other planes. Yes, we need basic services that maybe not everyone wants to do, like trash pickup and so on. And yet, we don't need the state in order to use forces of violence to get that done, right? There's other forms of social organization that will make sure all these things get done without the force and violence of the state to do that to us and upon us. So that's going to be the sort of the anarchism. How that all looks, that would require a whole course on just anarchism and looking at all the arguments and so on and so forth. But one common example, and this is where there's a kind of an overlap with anarchism and neoliberalism, or libertarianism in particular. Robert Nozick, who I think we talk about, I don't have my syllabus in front of me, but I think we talk about Nozick at the very end of the semester. I usually talk about Nozick and Rawls at the end of the semester, so I can pretty safely say that I probably put that in the syllabus again this time. Nozick's most famous book is Anarchy, State, Utopia. So he has anarchy in the title. Now, he's not quite an anarchist in the sense that Goldman is, but he does think that in certain contexts, things run best without it being top-down controlled, right? If we think of a state as controlling things from on top by force, then anarchy is things run without anyone in charge, without one on top, without rule, without law on top. Anarchy. So that's one way of understanding anarchy. And a market system is that, right? A market system. There's no one that. So if we think about like a very complicated city like New York and Manhattan, all the stuff that gets delivered to places throughout Manhattan and New York City and gets delivered largely on time and so on. I mean, just think about Amazon and all the orders that you place with Amazon and the like. There's no government or a person in charge that makes sure that those orders get to where they want to get. It's market systems that have figured out how to get these things done efficiently and on time. So markets are really anarchical systems. So there are examples that we can look to of things can get done and get done well without a top-down control. And so anarchists are doing that. But what the anarchists are also concerned with is that that individuals are encouraged to realize their self-consciousness, their internal value, and come to recognize the good within themselves and to live in accordance with that. So that is sort of where the anarchist will turn a lot of their attention. Um, and that kind of where it begins to turn on page 424. The last paragraph, or the second paragraph on the left of 424, says real wealth consists in things of utility and beauty, in things that help to create strong, beautiful bodies and surroundings inspiring to live in. But if man is doomed to wind cotton around a spool, or dig coal, or build roads for 30 years of his life, there can be no talk of wealth. What he gives to the world is only gray and hideous things, reflecting a dull and hideous existence, too weak to live, too cowardly to die. Strange to say, there are people who extol this deadening method of centralized production as the proudest achievement of our age. They fail utterly to realize that if we are to continue in machine subserviency, our slavery is more complete than was our bondage to the king. They do not want to know that centralization is not only the death knell of liberty, but also of health and beauty, of art and science, all these being impossible in a clock-like mechanical atmosphere. Now, I think there's a good point to be made here in terms of, as Thoreau would have said, that we are cogs in a machine, and that's kind of a deadening of our sensitivities, sensibilities, and makes us all sort of dumber. Just think about doing a routine, mechanical, mind-numbing task all day, but it's also very hard and exhausting. At the end of the day, you are useless. And so what's highest about human beings, their intelligence, their rationality, their creative potential, is just completely ignored and not nurtured in that kind of environment. Now, she doesn't address the fact that roads need to be built and other things need to be done. From what I know, the general approach to that is in a sort of decentralized, non-command structure where it gets done, but it's not one's life's work, right? It's not imposed upon one person to be doing it the whole time. How it gets done in a decentralized way, that is a question. But I guess, people spend a couple hours, oh, I'm going to work on the road for a couple hours, and then other people, and it just sort of gets done without one person being the sole and individual doing it, or small group of individuals. As you can see, these are some of the practical questions that come out as a result of anarchism. And this is where one of the distinctions that obviously kind of underlies this course, American Political Theory, is we've got the theory side of thinking about government, thinking about structures of government and the relationships between those who govern with power and the ability to inflict violence, and those who are governed and subject to that power and violence. So we have the theories about that. And then we have the practice, right? Then we have the practical implications of how this looks in reality. How does it get carried out? Where are some examples of this in practice? And I've given an example of sort of anarchy in practice with free markets as a sort of anarchical system. So we have seen some examples of that. And there may be examples that I'm not familiar of how sort of infrastructure tasks get done through a more anarchical system without a kind of top down. I mean, there are some anthropologists like David Graeber and David Wengrow. They both consider themselves anarchists, and they look at some of the non-developed societies, some of the in Brazil and other and Australia, and their lives. The tasks are done, and they aren't done with a hierarchical structure where most of the benefits of these tasks go to the top. They're done in a way that is somewhat shared and non-centralized and all to the benefit of everyone. Because granted, having good roads is to the benefit of everyone. So there is a sense then in which if it's to the benefit of everyone, then everyone is also in some sense obligated to be involved in the process. That's sort of the anarchist mindset, again, which follows from the notion that we aren't just individual, we are individual and social, and the social thrives when the individual is encouraged to realize themselves. So another aspect of anarchism is that it's not promoting just pure individualism, where we're kind of separate from other individuals and in competition with other individuals. That's kind of a divisive approach to individuality, right? Where we are seen as like on a game show where we are competing for a prize and only one person gets the prize. And so we aren't placed into a cooperative context, we're placed into a competitive context. And that's kind of the situation that the state, as I think the anarchist would see it, puts us in. Whereas what Goldman's talking about is we see in ourselves both our individual value and worth, but also our social value and worth. And so it's not separate from other individuals. We are individual, yet also social, will be part of what is being argued for here. Okay. Crime. Let's talk about crime. On page 426, she mentions crime as one of the big issues that is often seen as the justification for the state. I mean, this is with less than 2 weeks from the election. That's one of the big issues that politicians often run on, that crime is bad. I need to get crime under control. We need the powers of the state, powers of the police to keep crime at bay, to keep us safe. And so we often see crime as something that requires us to call on the powers and violence of the state to keep crime at bay. And so, and as an anarchist and as one who's calling for the abolition of the state and the violence of the state, one of the counter arguments for that anarchist argument is to say, but we need the power and violence of the state to keep crime at bay. It's kind of the Hobbesian picture of the state, where without a state, we'd have a state of war. And so we need the violence and the ability to enforce with violence the laws of the state so that we will have peace, order, stability, and a lack of crime or minimal amount of crime. So she takes that on. She takes on this issue of crime. And this is what she says. It's the second paragraph on the left, page 426. She says, crime is not but misdirected energy. So long as every institution of today, economic, political, social, and moral, conspires to misdirect human energy into wrong channels, so long as most people are out of place doing the things they hate to do, living a life they loathe to live, crime will be inevitable, and all the laws and the statutes can only increase but never do away with crime. So as she sees it, crime is a symptom of a bad social situation, of a bad social setup. Crime is basically a symptom of the state and the bad effects that the state produces on the individuals, forcing them to live a life they loathe to live, of having their energies directed into the wrong channels, putting them in a situation where they're doing the things they hate to do. if we are placed into a situation where we're doing things we love to do, where our energies are directed in places where we're wanting to direct them, we aren't going to have any motivation to do crime. That is her argument. And so there is, that is one of her arguments, is that a more healthy society is also going to be a society that has the least crime. So crime is going to be a symptom of an unhealthy society, and bringing more state and violence to combat crime is only going to make the society less healthy. It's not going to ultimately do away with the crime. Now, if anyone's a criminal justice major studying criminal justice, I'm sure there's a whole, I know there's a whole body of literature on issues of crime and different understandings of crime. And this is just one perspective, and there's other contrasting positions and arguments, of course. But it's interesting to kind of know these sorts of anarchist arguments about crime as a symptom of having states and of having structures of power that put us into situations that lead us to be unhappy, and it's that unhappiness that leads us into crime. Not everyone, of course, but some. So what's the solution to all this? Well, the solution to all this is to get rid of the state. So she says, the next, on the right-hand side of page 426, she says, to achieve such an arrangement of life, right, this is the arrangement of life that would make people happy, well-directed energies, lack of crime as a result, and so on. To achieve such an arrangement of life, government, with its unjust, arbitrary, repressive measures, must be done away with. At best, it has but imposed one single mode of life upon all, without regard to individual and social variation and needs. In destroying government and statutory laws, anarchism proposes to rescue the self-respect and independence of the individual from all restraint and invasion by authority. Only in freedom can man grow to his full stature. Only in freedom will he learn to think and move and give the very best in him. Only in freedom will he realize the true force of the social bonds which knit men together and which are the true foundation of normal social life. So I think that was the end of what I wanted to say about that particular. I want to say more about the women's emancipation. I say just a little bit, but you kind of get the basic idea then for Goldman. And this is just a taste of the anarchist argument, and there's a whole bunch of it. There's Kropotkin and others in the whole anarchist movement. So anyone who's interested in this as a topic, there's a lot out there to explore, and I'd recommend you do that if you're interested in it at all. But the basic, sort of in a nutshell, the basic argument is that, which goes back to Emerson and Thoreau, is that we as individuals already have within ourselves all we need to do good. It just needs to be fostered, nurtured, and given the right context and environment where we can fulfill our nature to be good individuals in a social context. And when we are realizing our full nature as good individuals in a social context, we don't need the state. The state, however, with its laws and its violence and its need for sort of a predictable populace, tends to impose its will through threats of violence and ultimately diminishes the sense of individual freedom, the sense of individual conscience and self-consciousness. And that ultimately makes situations worse rather than better. And as situations get worse, the calls for the state to exercise even more violence and control over individuals comes to the fore, and we end up in a kind of vicious cycle. The only way to get rid of this vicious cycle, according to the anarchists, is to eliminate the source of the problem in the first place, which is what she calls the state, hence the anarchism. So that's in a nutshell, that's sort of the anarchist argument for the kind of radical policies that they propose. And as you can see, it's not that greatly different from sort of a kind of extreme libertarianism that you might see among some contemporary political figures. Rand Paul, for instance, might be an example of some that falls into that category. So let me read one last thing. Emma Goldman is the first woman that we've been reading in this class. And so it's not surprising that she wrote on woman's emancipation. But what might be surprising is that her take on women's emancipation is not what one might expect, right? So let me read. There's one paragraph in particular that I think kind of highlights the general argument that she's making here. It's the paragraph that begins on the left of page 430. She says, emancipation has brought woman economic equality with man. That is, she can choose her own profession and trade, but as her past and present physical training has not equipped her with the necessary strength to compete with man, she is often compelled to exhaust all her energy, use up her vitality, and strain every nerve in order to reach the market value. Very few ever succeed, for it is a fact that women teachers, doctors, lawyers, architects, and engineers are neither met with the same confidence as their male colleagues, nor receive equal remuneration. And those that do reach that enticing equality generally do so at the expense of their physical and psychical well being. So, what she does here, what she's setting forth here in this argument is this notion that the women's emancipation movement is basically wanting to get women to have an opportunity to do the same job that men are doing. And yet, they are doing the same job, but often not at the same pay, and they're often exhausting themselves because they're trying to do the same work at the same level that men do it, and all that. But then she goes on and says, like, wait a minute, what what is the women's emancipation movement trying to do? They're trying to get into the same dysfunctional system that's the problem in the first place. And so, in some ways, the women's emancipation movement isn't the solution to the problem that the previous essay was dealing with, the problem of the state and the institutions of the state that kind of increase our ignorance, our dependency, and our lack of freedom. If anything, the contemporary women's emancipation movement is substituting one lack of freedom for another. Right? It's like, okay, maybe I'm no longer unfree with respect to participation in the institutions of the state, but now I am subject to the same institutions that men are, and with all the problems that go with that. So the women's emancipation movement is not the panacea that some women were thinking it was. I mean, clearly she does, as she goes on to say, um, on the last page, page 432, she says, salvation lies in an energetic march onwards towards a brighter and clearer future. We are in need of unhampered growth out of old traditions and habits. The movement for women's emancipation has so far made but the first step in that direction. It is to be hoped that it will gather strength to make another. The right to vote or equal civil rights may be good demands, but true emancipation begins neither at the polls nor in the courts. It begins in woman's soul. So again, just as with Emerson and Thoreau, the point for liberation is not to become subject to a new power and to have the same rights to be subject to that power as men, but ultimately for women as with men to live in accordance with their own conscience, with their own soul, to gain the same sort of emancipation that all anarchists seek for all people, men or women. So yes, it is ultimately a movement for women's emancipation, just as it is a movement for men's emancipation. But again, it's an emancipation from the oppressive, violent powers of the state. And so the women's emancipation movement that doesn't keep its eyes on that fact will ultimately just be reinforcing the status quo. And so she doesn't want to reinforce the status quo, but at the same time, she does think women ought to be able to vote and become participants insofar as doing that might enable them to change the system or to abolish the system. Again, some interesting stuff here with respect to anarchism. It has lived on in different forms with free market capitalism, as I've said, is a kind of contemporary form of anarchism. Libertarianism is a sort of contemporary form. There are lots of writings out there on anarchism. So, as I've said, anyone who's interested in this subject can go on and follow and read more about Emma Goldman and find a lot of other stuff. But I think that covers it for today. Good 30 minutes on Goldman. So I will see you all on Tuesday in the classroom, November 5th. Hope you all have a good weekend or have a good time while I was gone, and hope you go out and vote. I'll see you on Tuesday the 5th.